This podcast is about cadastral systems. A cadastral system is a method of surveying land, actually describing the dimensions and locations and area of a property, mainly for determining private ownership of land. Now, different cultures have different philosophies about land ownership, whether land can be privately owned or not. So not all cultures will have a cadastral system. But in the United States and in Europe, we do. And I want to discuss two cadastral systems, one that was used by the Europeans when they came to the U.S., when they came to the new land, and another system that was established when the United States gained its independence and became a nation. Before we begin, let's just take a look at two different landscapes from the air. This landscape is from over Ireland, and it's basically farmland. And you'll notice a sort of patchwork quality to the boundaries of different fields. It doesn't seem to have any systematic kind of organization to how those fields or how those properties are laid out. This landscape, this is actually an image from space rather than just from an airplane, but this image is of farmland in Kansas. And this is the United States. This is a different cadastral system used, and it's much more orderly. It's much more kind of grid-like, and I'll be discussing both of these cadastral systems in this podcast. First, let's talk about the one that was used in Europe and was used by Europeans when they came to the United States. It's known as the metes and bounds system, cadastral system, and it basically uses natural features in the landscape. Maybe it's a riverbed to define a property boundary. Maybe it's a mountain peak to define another property boundary. Or maybe it's changes in vegetation from a grassland to a forest. All of these are natural features in the landscape that were used in descriptions of properties, how the actual area size of a property, where one property boundary ended and a different property began. So most of Europe used this system. When the Europeans came to America, in the eastern colonies, all the properties were defined using the metes and bounds system. And many parts of California under Spanish rule, when they came and ruled California, when private lands were granted to citizens or people high up in the government, the system used to describe those lands was indeed metes and bounds. The cadastral system that is used in the United States and has been used in the United States since 1785, when the U.S. established the Land Ordinance, is known as the rectangular survey. And this system, this cadastral system, uses a grid, not quite latitude and longitude, but similar. It uses north-south running lines and east-west running lines to make a grid in order to describe property boundaries and areas of property. So this is the system used that created this landscape here of the farmland in Kansas. The rectangular survey established a systematic way of describing properties. The main purpose of this survey was to transfer land to private citizens. And the center point of that survey is located at Meads Ranch in Kansas, which happens to be about in the middle of the country. When we look at a map of the grid lines, the starting points for each state, you'll notice a north-south running line and an east-west running line in every state. And that would be the state's rectangular survey. That is all of these surveys are networked together, kind of linked together. But each state does have its own particular starting point, and grid. Notice in a state like California, because we are a very large state, we actually have a starting point in the southern portion of the state and another starting point for the grid in the northern portion of the state. So this podcast is really going to focus on how the rectangular system survey works, and I want you guys to be able to use that system when you're describing locations on the topographic maps that we'll be using in the map activity and on the map reading test. I do want to mention that some lands are not included in the public land survey of the Ordinance of 1785. Lands that were already surveyed by another system, particularly the metes and bounds system of the Eastern Colonies, but also the metes and bounds system that was used in land grants in places like California, maybe in Louisiana. Once a land has been surveyed under one cadastral system, the new cadastral system that may come into play in that area is not then overlaid upon that original system. So there will be parts of California that are not going to have the rectangular survey markings on it because they were previously surveyed under the metes and bounds. Other locations that are not included are bodies of water, because the beds of a lake or the bed of an ocean is not going to be privately owned, and therefore we don't need to be able to describe those properties. Places like military reservations and national parks are national resources and therefore are not privately owned. So again, we will not see the rectangular survey markings on maps of these areas. Also, mountaintops tend not to have the rectangular survey markings, generally because most mountaintop areas are not going to be suitable for farming and settling of land, and therefore we're not going to bother surveying those under this particular cadastral system.